October 27, 1962. The Sargasso Sea, off the coast of Cuba. Deep beneath the turbulent Atlantic waves, the Soviet submarine B-59 pitches and rolls in the darkness. The air inside is a choking haze, temperatures soaring past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity so thick it clings to every surface like a second skin. Sweat pours from the brows of the 78 crew members crammed into this steel tube, their uniforms sodden, their breaths shallow and labored. Carbon dioxide levels are dangerously high. Men gasp for air, some fainting from the heat and exhaustion. The batteries are nearly drained after days of silent running, evading the relentless pursuit of American warships. Emergency lights cast eerie shadows on the bulkheads, where gauges flicker and alarms whine intermittently. Explosions reverberate through the hull, depth charges from U.S. Navy destroyers and helicopters above, pounding like thunderclaps in the deep. To the crew, it feels like the end of the world. Captain Valentin Grigorievich Savitsky, his face etched with strain, clings to the periscope, barking orders through gritted teeth. "They're trying to sink us," he shouts, his voice echoing in the confined space. Beside him, political officer Ivan Semyonovich Maslyennikov nods fervently, his eyes burning with ideological fire. And then there's Vasili Alexandrovich Arkhipov, the flotilla's chief of staff, standing calm amid the chaos, his analytical mind racing through the implications. This is the story of the submarine that almost started World War III, the story of B-59, one of 4 Soviet Foxtrot-class diesel-electric submarines dispatched on a secret mission to the waters near Cuba. Each carried 22 torpedoes, including one with a nuclear warhead, a T-5, packing 10 kilotons of explosive power, equivalent to the bomb that devastated Hiroshima. If launched, it could obliterate an entire U.S. aircraft carrier task force, sending radioactive plumes across the ocean and likely triggering a full-scale nuclear exchange between the superpowers. The Cuban Missile Crisis was already the closest the world had come to Armageddon. B-59's fateful encounter pushed it even closer. To understand how a single submarine nearly ignited global catastrophe, we must go back to the origins of the crisis, to the geopolitical chess game that pitted the United States against the Soviet Union in a high-stakes standoff. By 1962, the Cold War had frozen the world into 2 hostile camps. The United States, under President John F. Kennedy, had encircled the Soviet Union with military bases and nuclear missiles. Jupiter missiles in Turkey, just 90 miles from Soviet borders, capable of striking Moscow in minutes. The Soviets felt vulnerable, humiliated by the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, where CIA-backed Cuban exiles tried and failed to overthrow Fidel Castro's regime. Khrushchev saw an opportunity in Cuba, the revolutionary island nation just 90 miles from Florida. Castro, fearing another U.S. invasion, welcomed Soviet aid. In secret, Operation Anadir was launched, shipping medium-range ballistic missiles to Cuba, where they could target major U.S. cities like Washington and New York. It was a bold move to level the playing field, to place nukes at America's doorstep just as America had done to the Soviets. But secrecy was paramount. The missiles were disguised as agricultural equipment, transported under cover of night. Enter the submarines. To protect the missile convoys from U.S. interference, Khrushchev ordered 4 Foxtrot-class subs, B-4, B-36, B-59, and B-130 to deploy from the Kola Peninsula in the Arctic. These were not nuclear-powered behemoths, but diesel-electric vessels, stealthy, but limited by the need to surface for battery recharges and air. Each was overloaded. Designed for 70 crew, they carried 78 plus 9 radio intelligence specialists from the OSNA's unit. The journey south was arduous, through icy northern waters into the warm Sargasso Sea, where seaweed choked the propellers and tropical heat turned the subs into pressure cookers. Vasili Arkhipov was the key figure aboard B-59, though not its captain. At 36, he was already a seasoned officer, serving as chief of staff for the entire submarine brigade and effectively the second in command on B-59. Born in 1926 in the modest village of Staraya Kupovna near Moscow, Arkhipov grew up in a peasant family, his father a farmer who had fought in the Russian Civil War. Young Vasily was bright, drawn to the sea despite his landlocked upbringing. He entered the Pacific Higher Naval School in 1942, amid World War II, graduating in 1947 and beginning a career that would test him in ways few could imagine. His first major trial came in 1961, aboard the K-19, a hotel-class nuclear submarine dubbed the Widowmaker for its string of accidents. During exercises in the North Atlantic, a reactor coolant leak threatened meltdown. Radiation levels spiked. The crew, including Arkhipov as deputy commander, improvised a repair under hellish conditions, welding pipes in a compartment flooded with steam and poison. 8 men died agonizing deaths from acute radiation syndrome. Arkhipov himself suffered exposure that would later contribute to his cancer. But his leadership prevented an explosion that could have contaminated the ocean and perhaps even been mistaken for a nuclear attack. For this, he received the Order of the Red Banner, though the incident was hushed up by Soviet authorities. Arkhipov's experience on K-19 forged his character. A man of quiet resolve, technical prowess, and a deep understanding of the perils of nuclear technology. He knew machines could fail, that panic could amplify errors, and that decisions made in isolation carried the weight of worlds. When assigned to the Cuban mission, he boarded B-59 with a sense of foreboding. The orders from Moscow were clear yet ambiguous. Protect the missile shipments, avoid detection, but if attacked, defend with all means necessary. The nuclear torpedoes were a last resort, authorized only under direct assault or loss of contact with command, conditions that, in the fog of war, could be interpreted broadly. The flotilla departed on October 1, 1962, slipping out of the Murmansk naval base under cover of darkness. The subs hugged the ocean floor, navigating through the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom gap, a choke point patrolled by NATO forces. They evaded early detection, but as they approached Cuban waters, the noose tightened. On October 14, U.S. U-2 spy planes photographed the missile sites in Cuba, sparking the crisis. Kennedy addressed the nation on October 22, announcing a naval quarantine, a blockade, to halt further Soviet shipments. Over 200 U.S. ships, including aircraft carriers like the USS Enterprise and USS Independence, fanned out across the Atlantic, armed with depth charges, torpedoes, and orders to force Soviet subs to surface. Aboard B-59, the crew listened to American radio broadcasts leaking through the depths, news of the blockade, of U.S. mobilization, of the world on the brink. Tensions mounted as the sub's systems strained. The diesel engines meant for colder climates overheated in the tropics. Air regenerators failed, filling the compartments with toxic fumes. Men stripped to their waists, rationing water and food. Captain Savitsky, a veteran of World War II submarine warfare, pushed the crew hard, but morale frayed. Political officer Maslenikov rallied them with speeches about defending socialism, but fear gnawed at everyone. What if war had already begun? Radio contact with Moscow was spotty. U.S. sonar jammed communications, leaving the sub in a bubble of uncertainty. By October 24, the crisis escalated. Soviet missile transports turned back at Khrushchev's order, but the subs pressed on, ordered to hold position east of the quarantine line. B-130, plagued by engine troubles, surfaced early and was harassed by U.S. forces. B-59 dove deeper, playing a deadly game of hide and seek. American P-3 Orion aircraft and destroyers like the USS Beale and USS Coney dropped practice depth charges. Grenade-sized explosives meant to signal surface or be destroyed, not to kill. But to the Soviets, isolated and uninformed, they sounded like full-scale attacks. Explosions shook the hull, cracking pipes and shattering nerves. "It's like sitting in a metal barrel being beaten with a sledgehammer," one crewman later recalled. As the barrage intensified on October 27, Savitsky reached his breaking point. Believing B-59 was under lethal assault and that Moscow might already be in ruins, he ordered the nuclear torpedo loaded. The T-5, with its 10-kiloton yield, could create a massive underwater shock wave, destroying ships within a half-mile radius and sending fallout ashore. Protocol on Foxtrot subs required consensus from the captain, political officer, and executive officer for nuclear use. Maslenikov agreed, driven by duty to strike the imperialists, but Arkhipov, with his higher rank of brigade chief of staff, held veto power. He argued vehemently. The charges weren't destructive enough to be real attacks. Surfacing risked capture but not annihilation. Launching would invite retaliation, dooming not just them but millions. The debate raged in the command center, voices rising over the din of explosions. Arkhipov drew on his K-19 ordeal, reminding them how haste nearly killed them all before. He calculated the odds. No confirmed war above, no direct hits below. His calm logic pierced the panic. After tense minutes, perhaps hours, the captain relented. B-59 surfaced amid the U.S. fleet, its crew emerging into the sunlight defiant but alive. American sailors gawked from their decks. Helicopters hovered overhead. The sub recharged its batteries under watchful eyes, then dove again, eventually returning home without incident. This moment, unknown to the world for decades, was the crisis's hidden fulcrum. Kennedy and Khrushchev negotiated in the open, but beneath the waves, Archipov's restraint saved humanity from the abyss. Had the torpedo fired, the USS Randolph carrier group would have been vaporized, prompting U.S. invasion of Cuba and Soviet missile launches. Nuclear winter could follow, billions perishing in fire and famine. Archipov's story emerged slowly after the Cold War. Declassified documents in the 1990s revealed the nuclear torpedoes. A 2002 conference in Havana stunned U.S. officials like Robert McNamara with the details. "We came that close," McNamara said, holding his fingers an inch apart. Archipov's widow, Olga, shared his understated view. He saw it as duty, not drama. In 2017, he was posthumously honored by the Future of Life Institute. Yet his legacy endures as a testament to human judgment in the nuclear age. In a world still armed with thousands of warheads, submarines patrol silently, their commanders holding apocalyptic power. Archipov's choice whispers a warning. Technology and ideology can push toward destruction, but wisdom can pull back. The Sargasso Sea standoff wasn't just a footnote to the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was the submerged thread that nearly unraveled everything. The crisis didn't end there, of course. Back in Washington, Kennedy's ex-com debated invasion plans, unaware of the nuclear torpedoes or the 40,000 Soviet troops already in Cuba with tactical nukes. Khrushchev, in Moscow, paced the Kremlin, weighing bluster against brinkmanship. But for B-59, the surface meant survival. The sub limped back to the Soviet Union, its crew heroes in secret, reprimanded publicly for weakness in surfacing. Admiral Vitaly Fokin reportedly fumed, "You didn't surface, you popped up like a cork." Arkhipov rose to vice admiral, heading naval academies, but the radiation from K-19 caught up with him, claiming him in 1998 at 72. His grave in Moscow is modest, his name etched in history books as the man who said no. Today, with renewed great power tensions, Russia's subs probing NATO waters, China's fleet expanding, the lessons resonate. Delegated nuclear authority, communication blackouts, misperceived signals, all persist. Arkipov's poise under pressure reminds us that peace often hinges on individuals defying the tide. To fully grasp the stakes, consider the broader canvas of 1962. The year began with hope. Kennedy's Alliance for Progress aimed to uplift Latin America, but soured quickly. The Berlin Wall stood as a scar. Atmospheric nuclear tests poisoned the skies. Castro's Cuba, a beacon for revolutionaries, terrified Washington. When U-2 photos revealed missile silos, panic gripped the White House. Curtis LeMay, Air Force chief, pushed for bombing. Kennedy opted for blockade, buying time. Meanwhile, Soviet sailors endured hell. B-59's logs, later declassified, detail the ordeal. Crew exhausted, hallucinations from CO2, ready to fight but praying for orders. Arkipov's diary entries, sparse and factual, hint at inner turmoil. Must maintain discipline, war not inevitable. His veto wasn't pacifism. He was a loyal officer, but calculated risk assessment. In submarine warfare, where seconds decide fates, his deliberation was revolutionary. Historians debate what-ifs. If Arkhipov had been on another sub, like B-130, which surfaced without nuclear drama. If Savitsky had overridden him. Simulations suggest escalation. U.S. carriers sunk, invasion launched, Soviet nukes fired on beaches, then cities. Fallout models predict global cooling, crop failures, mass starvation. The doomsday clock ticked to midnight. Back in Moscow, the flotilla's return was met not with fanfare, but with criticism. Admiral Anatoly Gorshkov, head of the Soviet Navy, berated the commanders for revealing their positions by surfacing. "You didn't just surface, you popped up like corks," he reportedly snapped during a debriefing. For Savitsky, the reprimand stung. He had followed protocol under unimaginable pressure, only to be second-guessed. Arkhipov, however, faced no formal censure. His rank as Chief of Staff and his reputation from the K-19 incident shielded him, though no commendations followed. The Soviet system valued obedience over initiative, and Arkipov's decision to prioritize de-escalation over retaliation was a quiet rebellion against doctrine. The broader Cuban Missile Crisis began to unwind in the days that followed. On October 28, Khrushchev announced the withdrawal of Soviet missiles from Cuba, prompted by Kennedy's public pledge not to invade the island and a secret agreement to remove U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The hotline between Washington and Moscow, established in 1963, was a direct outcome of the crisis, designed to pierce the fog of miscommunication that had nearly doomed the world. But the submarine's role, particularly B-59's brush with nuclear launch, remained classified. The Soviet Union buried the incident, unwilling to admit how close its own forces had come to sparking war. The crews were ordered to silence, their logs sealed in archives. Arkhipov returned to duty, his career continuing its steady ascent. By the 1970s, he was promoted to Rear Admiral, later Vice Admiral, and took on leadership roles at the Kirov Naval Academy in Leningrad. He was a teacher as much as a sailor, shaping the next generation of officers with lessons from the deep. Yet he rarely spoke of B-59, even to his wife Olga or their son. His diaries, later shared by his family, reveal a man who saw his actions as duty, not heroism. We followed orders, but we also thought for ourselves. The world was not ready to end. The radiation exposure from K-19 took its toll. By the 1980s, health issues, likely linked to that earlier disaster, forced his retirement. He settled in Moscow, living modestly until kidney cancer claimed him in 1998 at age 72. The world remained ignorant of Archipov's role for decades. The Cold War's end in 1991 cracked open Soviet archives, and whispers of the submarine incident began to surface. In 2002, at a Havana conference marking the crisis's 40th anniversary, Soviet veterans like Vadim Orlov, a B-59 officer, shared details with stunned American counterparts. Robert McNamara, Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, listened in disbelief as he learned of the nuclear torpedo and Archipov's veto. "We were that close," McNamara said, pinching his fingers an inch apart. Thomas Blanton of the National Security Archive dubbed Arkhipov the guy who saved the world. Declassified documents corroborated the account. The sub's authorization to use nuclear weapons under attack, the loss of radio contact, the misinterpreted depth charges. The revelation reshaped historical understanding of the crisis. It wasn't just the missile negotiations or Kennedy's restraint that saved the day. It was a submerged drama where a single officer's judgment averted apocalypse. Archipov's wife Olga provided further insight, sharing his sparse but poignant diary entries. October 27th, depth charges relentless. Savitsky wanted to fight. I said no. We cannot start this war. Her accounts painted a man haunted by the weight of his choice, but resolute in its necessity. In 2017, the Future of Life Institute honored Arkhipov posthumously with its award for reducing existential risks, cementing his legacy as a guardian of humanity. The incident's implications stretch far beyond 1962. B-59's near launch exposes the fragility of nuclear deterrence, a system built on the assumption that rational actors will always prevail. But rationality falters under pressure. Savitsky and Maslenikov, driven by fear and isolation, were ready to act on incomplete information. The U.S. Navy, unaware of the nuclear torpedoes, used signaling depth charges that the Soviets perceived as lethal. This miscommunication, born of technological limits and mutual suspicion, mirrors other Cold War close calls, like Stanislav Petrov's 1983 radar glitch, where he ignored a false missile alert, or the 1983 Able Archer exercise, misunderstood by the Soviets as a NATO attack. Archipov's decision highlights the human element in nuclear strategy. Machines, be they sonar systems or early warning radars, can mislead. Doctrines, like the Soviet protocol allowing submarine commanders to use nukes under attack, can amplify errors. In B-59's case, the delegation of nuclear authority to field officers was a pragmatic necessity. Surface commands could be obliterated in a first strike, leaving subs as the last line of retaliation. But this autonomy, coupled with communication blackouts, created a powder keg. Archipov's restraint was not pacifism, but pragmatism. He saw no evidence of war above, only signals below. His K-19 experience, where panic nearly caused disaster, taught him to question haste. Today, the lessons resonate. Nuclear submarines remain the stealthy backbone of deterrence, with U.S., Russian, and Chinese fleets patrolling global waters. Modern subs carry warheads dwarfing the T-5's power, and their crews operate in similar isolation. The 2009 collision between British and French nuclear subs in the Atlantic underscores ongoing risks. Accidents can escalate without clear communication. Cyber warfare adds new perils. Hacked sonar or spoofed signals could mimic an attack, pushing commanders toward rash decisions. Artificial intelligence, now integrated into targeting and navigation, raises questions about over-reliance on automation. What if an algorithm, blind to context, recommends launch? Archipov's story urges safeguards, robust communication channels, transparency in military exercises, and training that emphasizes skepticism over blind obedience. Treaties like the New START, limiting strategic arsenals, are vital but insufficient. Nations must address the psychological toll on commanders, men and women who, like Arkhipov, bear godlike power in moments of crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis saw the hotline established, but modern crises, like Russia's actions in Ukraine or China's naval expansion, demand more. Submarine encounters in the South China Sea or Arctic could spark miscalculations, especially if commanders lack Archipov's clarity. His legacy is not just about averting war, but about the courage to defy pressure. Soviet military culture prized loyalty. Arkhipov risked court-martial by opposing Savitsky, yet his gamble preserved a world unaware of its debt. Historians estimate that a nuclear torpedo strike on the USS Randolph could have killed 10,000 sailors instantly, prompted a U.S. invasion of Cuba, and triggered Soviet missile launches. Fallout models predict billions dead from direct blasts, radiation, and nuclear winter. Cities like Moscow, New York, and Havana would have been ash. Archipov's veto stopped the dominoes before they fell. As the crisis faded, Kennedy and Khrushchev emerged as its public faces, their diplomacy hailed as the bulwark against war. But the submerged truth was messier. B-59's crew, sworn to secrecy, carried the burden of their near-fatal choice. Arkhipov, ever the quiet professional, resumed his duties without fanfare. His later years at the Naval Academy focused on instilling discipline tempered by judgment, lessons drawn from the Sargasso Sea. When he died, his obituary was brief, mentioning only his naval service, not his world-saving act. Yet his story, once unearthed, became a beacon for those grappling with the nuclear age's enduring dangers. The B-59 incident parallels other unsung acts of restraint. Petrov's 1983 decision to ignore a false alarm echoes Archipov's logic. Both men trusted their instincts over systems, risking their careers to save millions. Both expose the paradox of nuclear deterrence. Designed to prevent war, it invites accidents through its complexity. In 2025, with over 12,000 warheads globally and new players like North Korea wielding nukes, the stakes remain high. Submarines, silent and unseen, still hold the power to end civilization. Archipov's example, calm, calculated, and human, reminds us that wisdom, not technology, is our last defense. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 passed into history as a triumph of diplomacy, with John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev lauded for pulling the world back from the edge of nuclear war. Yet the true fulcrum of that near apocalypse lay not in Washington or Moscow, but in the stifling confines of the Soviet submarine B-59, where Vasili Arkhipov's quiet resolve stopped a nuclear torpedo from igniting global catastrophe. As the crisis receded, the world moved on. Cities bustled, families grew, life continued, oblivious to how close it had come to annihilation. Arkhipov's story, buried in Soviet secrecy for decades, emerged only later as a stark reminder of humanity's fragility and the power of individual judgment in the face of apocalyptic stakes. In the days following B-59's surfacing on October 27, 1962, the crew faced a grueling return to the Soviet Union. The submarine, battered by weeks of evasion and tropical heat, limped back to the Kola Peninsula, its diesel engines coughing and batteries barely functional. The crew, exhausted and malnourished, bore the psychological scars of their ordeal: hallucinations from carbon dioxide poisoning, the terror of depth charges, the weight of nearly starting a war. Captain Valentin Savitsky, still stinging from the decision to surface, braced for scrutiny. Political officer Ivan Maslenikov, his ideological zeal tempered by the reality of near destruction, remained silent. Arkhipov, ever composed, focused on keeping the crew cohesive, his diary noting only, "returned safely, duty fulfilled." Upon arrival, the flotilla faced a cold reception. Soviet Naval Command, led by Admiral Anatoly Gorshkov, viewed the surfacing of B-59 and other subs as a failure of stealth, a blot on the Navy's honor. "You let the Americans see you," Gorshkov reportedly thundered, ignoring the impossible conditions: U.S. sonar traps, communication blackouts, and non-lethal depth charges mistaken for attacks. The nuclear torpedo's near use was never mentioned. It was too sensitive, too damning to admit that a field commander's discretion had nearly unleashed Armageddon. Arkhipov, as Chief of Staff, escaped direct punishment, his K-19 heroism and senior rank offering protection. But no medals came, no public acknowledgement. The Soviet system, rigid and hierarchical, valued compliance over the kind of independent thinking Arkhipov demonstrated. Life resumed for Arkhipov. He rose through the ranks, becoming Rear Admiral in the 1970s and later Vice Admiral, commanding respect as head of the Kirov Naval Academy. There he trained young officers in navigation, strategy, and the unspoken art of staying calm under pressure. To his students, he was a stern but fair mentor, rarely mentioning Cuba. His wife Olga later recalled his reticence. Vasili didn't boast. He said only that he did what was necessary. The radiation from K-19, however, lingered in his body, sowing seeds of kidney cancer that would claim him in 1998 at 72. His later years were quiet, spent in a modest Moscow apartment with Olga and their son, far from the spotlight of his world-saving act. The B-59 incident remained classified until the Soviet Union's collapse opened the archives. In the 1990s, researchers began piecing together the story. A 2002 Havana conference marking the crisis's 40th anniversary brought Soviet veterans face-to-face with American officials like Robert McNamara. The revelation of the nuclear torpedo stunned the room. "We had no idea," McNamara admitted, his voice heavy with the weight of hindsight. Soviet officer Vadim Orlov described the heated debate aboard B-59, Arkhipov's firm "no" cutting through the panic. Declassified logs confirmed it. Captain proposed T-5 launch. Chief of Staff vetoed. surfaced to avoid escalation. Olga Arkhipova shared her husband's diaries, their terse entries a window into his mind. War not confirmed, must preserve peace. The world took notice. Historians like Thomas Blanton called Arkhipov the man who saved the world. In 2017, the Future of Life Institute awarded him posthumously for averting existential risk. Documentaries and books followed, painting him as a reluctant hero whose pragmatism outshone ideology. Yet in Russia, his story remained muted. The military culture that reprimanded him for surfacing never embraced his defiance of protocol. Unlike Stanislav Petrov, whose 1983 radar glitch decision earned global acclaim, Archipov's role stayed a footnote in his homeland, his grave unadorned by state honors. Why does this matter? Because Archipov's choice illuminates the razor-thin margins of the nuclear age. The Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't just about missiles in silos. It was about submerged decisions made in isolation that could have ended everything. The U.S. Navy, unaware of the T-5 torpedo, used signaling depth charges that B-59's crew mistook for war. Soviet protocol allowed nuclear use if commanders believed they were under attack, a policy born of fear that Moscow might be ashes before orders arrived. Archipov's veto, grounded in his K-19 lesson that haste breeds disaster, stopped a chain reaction. A torpedo strike on the USS Randolph, a U.S. invasion of Cuba, Soviet missiles launched, and a nuclear exchange killing billions. This fragility persists. In 2025, over 12,000 nuclear warheads remain, with Russia, the U.S., and China maintaining vast submarine fleets. These vessels, armed with megaton yield missiles, patrol unseen, their crews as isolated as B-59s. A 2009 collision between British and French subs in the Atlantic, both nuclear-armed, shows accidents are real. Cyber threats add new risks. Hacked sensors could fake an attack, pushing commanders to act. Artificial intelligence guiding modern subs lacks human nuance. What if an algorithm misreads a signal, as B-59's crew nearly did? Archipov's legacy demands action. Nations must bolster crisis communication, hotlines, secure channels, joint exercises to clarify intent. Treaties like New START, limiting arsenals, need expansion, not expiration. Training must emphasize critical thinking, as Archipov's did, over blind adherence to protocol. The psychological toll on commanders facing decisions that could end humanity requires support, not stigma. Russia's actions in Ukraine, China's naval buildup, and North Korea's provocations echo 1962's tensions. A misstep in the South China Sea or Arctic could spiral as quickly as B-59 standoff did. His courage was not cinematic heroism, but a quiet refusal to act rashly. In a system that demanded obedience, Arkhipov risked everything: career, reputation, even life, to say no. He wasn't driven by pacifism, but by logic. No war above, no need to start one below. His humility afterward, dismissing his role as just duty, contrasts with the era's bombast: Khrushchev's threats, Kennedy's resolve, Castro's defiance. Yet it was this unassuming sailor who held the world's fate. The lessons are urgent. Nuclear deterrence assumes rational actors, but humans falter under stress. Systems fail. Sonar misreads. Satellites glitch. Protocols lag behind reality. Archipov's story joins others. Petrov's 1983 stand, the 1983 Able Archer scare, the 1995 Norwegian rocket panic. Each time, individuals, not systems, saved the day. In an age of AI-driven warfare and rising global tensions, we need more Archipovs, people trained to question, to pause, to choose life over dogma. His death in 1998 went unnoticed by most. No parades marked his passing. No statues rose in Moscow. But his true monument is the world itself. Cities unburned, lives unlost, futures preserved. On October 27, 1962, Vasili Arkhipov didn't just save his crew or his nation, he saved civilization from a war it didn't know it faced. As we navigate a new era of nuclear risks, his example shines. In the depths of crisis, wisdom can still prevail if only we dare to trust it.